Welcome back to another Through the Bible study. We're going verse by verse through the entire Bible. We're now into Genesis chapter 31, and this is talking about the story of Jacob. Real quickly, let me just put this in context for those who don't watch every single program, that Jacob really kind of came on the scene in chapter 26, I believe it was, and in chapter 27 is where he stole the blessing from Isaac and stole it from his brother, and because of that, he had to flee for his life. Chapter 28 is where he was fleeing out of the promised land, and he was going towards Haran, where his uncle lived, and he had an encounter with the Lord, and God spoke to him and said, "You are now the blessed of the Lord." And Jacob wasn't truly a believer at this time. He said, "If these things you are promising me come to pass, then you will be my God." So he began to start seeking God, but he was still a crook, and he was a liar and a deceiver at that time. In chapter 29, he comes to Laban, and he falls in love with Rachel, and the deceiver winds up being deceived. He reaps what he sows, and instead of getting his wife, Rachel, that he worked 7 years for, he got her older sister, Leah. And then at the end of the week, he was given Rachel, but he had to work another 7 years for that. So a total of 14 years he wound up with these two sisters as his wives, plural, which caused tremendous amount of problems. And in chapter 29 and 30, as we went through Genesis, it just amplified the contention that was going on between them, and it will just continue to get worse. This is a lot of the foundation of why the brothers of Joseph hated him so much, because they were from the wife and from the maidens of the wives that weren't loved the way that Rachel was. And so that it just caused all kinds of problems, and it's a great lesson for us of why polygamy is not good. And so anyway, we have gone now through 20 years of Jacob being with Laban in the land of Syria, and he worked 14 years for his two wives and their two maidens, their slaves that were with them. And then he worked another 6 years, and he began to start breeding the animals in a way that all of the animals begin to start having these special markings on them. And that was the contract that he had with Laban. That was in the 30th chapter. And so here in chapter 31, this is Genesis chapter 31, after he had done this special breeding and all of the animals were beginning to have these marks, it says in chapter 31, verse 1, "And he heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's he hath gotten all of this glory." And again, this has to do with all of the animals. He was breeding all of the animals in a way that they had these special markings. You know, I don't know a lot about this, but I did study some of this when I was in school. And through selective breeding, you can have certain traits that are dominant and other traits that are recessive. And if you know what you're doing, you can make the animals all start coming out a certain way. And so this is what he did. And it's going to reveal in this chapter that this was because of a dream that God had given him. So in verse 2 it says, "And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before." Now Laban was a crook himself, and Laban had taken advantage of Jacob. And so it's not like Laban was this real upstanding person and all of a sudden he had changed. But as long as he could use Jacob and all of his expertise, and under Jacob's leadership, Laban's cattle and all of his flocks and herds had increased tremendously. And so Laban was really profiting from Jacob during the first 14 years when he worked for his two wives. But when they made this other deal about all of these special animals with the markings on them, Jacob began to selectively breed all of these animals, and because of it, Laban was losing. His flocks were decreasing, and Jacob's were increasing tremendously, so much so that the children even said that Jacob has taken away everything that belonged to our father. So that's the reason that his countenance changed. It wasn't like he was an upstanding person before and something had happened. No, he was a crook before, but as long as everything was working out to his advantage, he was fine with Jacob. And there's a lesson in this for all of us, that there are people that as long as they can use us, they will treat us nice. But man, the moment you get to where you aren't an asset, you aren't doing what they want, they will kick you to the curb. Boy, you need to learn this with people. There are very few people in life that will truly love you with a God kind of love, where they will love you even when you fail, when you mess up, when something doesn't work out right. Those people who love you just because they are a good person and they love you for who you are, not what you can do to them, those people are rare, few and far between, and we need to cultivate those kind of relationships. And we need to recognize that there's a lot of people that will love us and treat us good as long as we are benefiting them. But the moment we cease to be an asset, man, it's over. And that's what's happening with Laban right here. In verse 3 it says, "And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." Now this will factor in to the chapters later on in a big way. When Jacob actually begins to start coming to Esau, his brother, and his brother is coming to him with 400 people against him, I guarantee you they didn't have 400 people that were coming just to greet him and say, "We're glad to see you." They were coming, Esau had vowed to kill Jacob. And this was a conflict, and 400 people coming with Esau. And Jacob will quote this verse right here. Of course, it wasn't written down, but he will quote what God said to him about, "You said that I will be with you and that I will prosper you." And Jacob depended on this promise from God. Did you know every one of us is going to come into problems in our life, and we're going to have negative circumstances come against us, and you need promises from God that you can depend upon. And you know, you can't have that if you aren't seeking God and if you aren't listening to Him and following His leadership. If you're doing your own thing and you go out there and you come up with all of these harebrained ideas on your own, you aren't going to be able to rely on the fact that, "God, I'm doing what you told me." So you need to not lean unto your own understanding. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5, "In all of your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your steps." You need to have God's direction in your life. And just because you have the direction, Jacob came into some serious problems, but because he had a word from God, he was able to persevere and get through them. He was able to anchor his faith to that. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God, Romans chapter 10, verse 17. So what is God telling you to do? God told Jacob to now return. It was time to return. And He says, "I'm going to be with you and I'm going to prosper you." That became something super important, and he will quote that later on. In verse 4 it says, "And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto the flocks. And he said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not towards me as before, but the God of my father hath been with me." Now again, this is reflecting that Jacob had changed over these 20 years. It was a total of 20 years, 14 years working for Rachel and Leah, 6 years out of the 7-year contract he had working with Laban for the cattle and all of the flocks that he had. And so it had been 20 years, and he said that his countenance had changed, and it had not been with him as it was before. And in verse 6, he says, "And ye see, and you know that with all my power I have served your father." Again, this is a point that I made previously. You can go back to Ephesians chapter 6, and it says, "Whatever you do, do it heartily as unto the Lord and not unto man, knowing that of the Lord you shall receive the reward of inheritance." So many people work for a boss instead of working for God. Now, God will use you working for somebody. I'm not saying that you just sit there and do nothing and expect God to rain it out of the sky. It says, if you don't work, don't eat. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10. We are supposed to be working, but you need to see God as your source. And when you're doing a job, you don't need to do it unto men. You need to do it unto God with all of your heart. And God will bless you beyond just that paycheck. He will bless you beyond what just your boss can do. If you do things heartily as unto the Lord, promotion will come. It says in Psalms chapter 75 that promotion, I think it's verse 6, promotion doesn't come from the east or from the west or from the south, but it's God that sets up one and puts down another. God is the one who promotes people. And if you would get in and work with all of your might, and whether the boss sees it or not, you do it to the Lord, man, God will prosper you. I got a great testimony about this. I don't want to take the time to go into the whole thing, but Paul Milligan, who used to run my ministry, at one time was working for a large corporation. He was making these multi-million-dollar deals, but his boss was taking credit for what Paul was doing. And Paul had an opportunity to be offended. But he chose to take those scriptures out of Ephesians and work unto the Lord. And he said he was going to keep doing his best job. He was not going to get bitter. He even told his boss, who was stealing his jobs, that he was the one that was getting this, and yet his boss was getting the commissions. And he even told his boss that he was just going to serve him and make him prosperous. Did you know it was just a short period of time, a year or two, until the big bosses over his immediate boss came to him and asked him some questions, and they said, we didn't think that this guy was smart enough to be doing this. We thought you were the one. And they wound up firing this guy who had been taking credit for what Paul had done. They promoted Paul, and I mean, he prospered supernaturally, and it became a foundation for everything else that he had done. When you do things as unto the Lord, you are going to be rewarded by the Lord. And so this is what Jacob was saying, that he had served God with all of his power, or served Laban with all of his power, but it was because he was doing it as unto the Lord. In verse 7 it says, and your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. Again, there is only one instance that we have of where Laban changed his wages, and that was when he substituted Leah on the wedding night instead of Rachel. And that was a terrible thing to do, but that's only one time. Right here, Jacob said it had happened 10 times. And so there's a lot of things happened that weren't recorded in this situation. But also notice that Jacob said that God suffered him not to hurt me. Jacob now has grown. Over 20 years, he has grown to where he has a relationship with God, where he is trusting God, and he's crediting God for the blessing and the prosperity that he has. In verse 8, it says, if he said thus, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. And if he said thus, the ringstrake shall be thy hire, then bear all the cattle ringstrake. So again, this goes back to what I said at the end of the previous chapter, that Jacob did these things and took stakes and peeled the bark off, and he did things, I think, as much for him as anything else. But this shows you right here what he said in verse 8, that it was God's blessing. It wasn't some incantation. It wasn't some witchcraft that he was using that caused these animals to have these markings. It was God's blessing, and that's what he's saying right here in verse 8, that whatever Laban said, that's the way that all of these animals were going to produce. In verse 9, thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me. So again, here is a different Jacob. He's different than he was 20 years before. And now he's crediting God, and he's recognizing God as the source of everything. And look at this in verse 10. I had referred to this in the previous chapter, but verse 10 says, and it came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up mine eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ringstrake, speckled, and grizzled. And the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here am I. And he said unto me, Lift up thine eyes and see all the rams which leapt upon the cattle, and ringstraked and speckled and grizzled. For I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. And so right here, he was crediting God, and he had seen all of this in a vision. So again, you've got to really study the Word in order to get this. If you just took the 30th chapter by itself, it might look like that Jacob just came up with this on his own. But this makes it very clear as he's explaining to Rachel and Leah that he had seen this in a dream, and an angel of the Lord had spoken to him and told him about how all of these cattle were going to start bearing these special markings. And so the angel went on to say in verse 13, I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowest a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from thy land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. And so here he is, this angel spoke to him in this dream and made reference to Bethel. Now again, if this had not been God, if this had been somebody else, nobody else would have known about this. He didn't tell everybody about what happened at Bethel, but in this dream, God appeared to him, and the angelic messenger reminded him, and so he connected all of the dots, and by this time, Jacob had made a promise in the 28th chapter that if you will honor your word and all of these promises about me being the blessed of the Lord come to pass, then you will be my God. And so I believe that right here is where this conversion was made. It may have been coming gradually, but he was now totally seeking the Lord, and God appeared unto him, and the Lord spoke to him about leaving, and he had called his wives, and he was getting ready to obey what God told him. In verse 14 it says, And Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, Is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted of him strangers? For he hath sold us, and hath quite devoured also our money. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. And again, you could make a bigger thing. I could spend more time on this, but I've made this point that Jacob reaped what he sowed, and he was taken advantage of. Laban took advantage of Jacob. Now Laban is reaping what he's sown, and his own daughters here, they don't have any affinity towards their father at all. He had prostituted his daughters. He had made money off of them, and he had taken advantage of Jacob through all this thing. And there was no love lost between Laban and his daughters, Rachel and Leah. And so all of these things that are being recounted, this isn't the way that it should be. This isn't the way that God ordered it to be. This was flesh. Flesh on Jacob's part, flesh on Laban's part, flesh on Leah and Rachel's part, the contention that was between them. There had been a lot of wrong things, and yet God uses all of these things to establish the 12 patriarchs of Israel. This is a graphic illustration of Romans 8:28, how God can take anything. It doesn't say that He's the one that does those things, but He can make all things work together for good to them who love Him, to them who are the called according to His purpose. So even if you've messed up big time, if you're like Jacob and you've been a deceiver and then you've been deceived and taken advantage of, and regardless of how bad your life is, God used all of these things and worked it together for good and provided a tremendous family and inheritance for Jacob. And so regardless of what you've done, God can also turn these things around. But Jacob had to come around. He was now submitted to God. He was now listening to God. And even at the potential damage to himself, I mean, Laban could have come against him because he broke the contract. The contract was to serve another 7 years for all of these animals. He was only 6 years into this contract, but God had given him a special word and told him now is the time to go. And so he was potentially going to suffer for this. Laban could have come and have done something to him, but he was obeying God. You've got to do what God tells you to do. And so in verse 17, then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting which he had gotten in Pandanaram, for to go unto Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. So it had been 20 years at this time, and I'm sure that there was some type of communication, maybe letters or words from merchants and things, but there had been no contact between Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob for 20 years. And in verse 19 it says, and Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. I mentioned this in the previous chapter, but even though Jacob had now gotten to where he was communing with God, he was obeying God, he was putting his life at risk to obey God, and he was now seeking God, Rachel was not seeking God. She had stolen away these images, probably because she was an idol worshiper, but at the very least, even if she wasn't committed to these idols, she was a thief to steal these idols. And apparently they were probably gold and they were worth a lot. At the very least, she was covetous and a thief. And at the very worst, she was an idol worshiper. In verse 20, it says, and Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. In the previous verses, it says he was shearing his sheep. And so for 3 days, he was having this festival and shearing all of his sheep. And Jacob already had put 3 days distance between Laban and his flocks. And so he had 3 days just in separation of the animals, plus he had 3 days that he left before Laban found out what had happened. So that gave him a head start in going back towards the promised land where Isaac and Rebekah were. And in verse 21, it says, so he fled with all that he had and rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. And it was told Laban on the 3rd day that Jacob was fled. And he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said unto him, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Now this is important, and this factors in later on, and Laban will refer to this. But the Lord had promised Jacob that return, and I will be with you. And here he is, God intervened because Laban was up to no good. He was coming to do Jacob hurt, and yet God intervened in this dream. So God was fulfilling his promise to Jacob that he would take care of him. And you know, the Lord will fulfill his promise to us too. If you are doing what God tells you to do, even if it looks like that obeying God is to your detriment, God will work other people. Laban was not a godly person. He was a liar and a deceiver. He had taken advantage of Jacob. He had these idols that Rachel had stolen. So he wasn't a godly person, and yet God intervened on his behalf. God will intervene for us, even with the ungodly. There's a scripture that says when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. And did you know that that will come to pass for us too? This is one of the things that we can learn. If he did this for Jacob, he'll do it for us. And so in verse 25, then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what hast thou done that thou hast stolen away unawares to me and hast carried away my daughters as captives, taken with the sword? Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly and steal away from me, and didst not tell me that I might have sent thee away with mirth and with songs and with tabret and with harp? You know, again, I think that this is a lie on Laban's part. His actions are completely contrary to this. He didn't care anything about his daughters. He had prostituted his daughters. He had taken advantage of them for his own benefit. And Rachel and Leah, their own statements that they made in this chapter showed that there was no love between them and their father. I believe he's just saying these things, but he had intended to do harm unto Jacob for breaking that contract, and that's the reason he brought all of these people with him. And so in verse 28, and he says, and hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. So right here, Laban is revealing that he had the thought, the power to do hurt unto Jacob, because Jacob had broken the contract, and I don't know exactly what could have happened, but in those days there wasn't the same I don't know, government system that we have today where every person that does something wrong is punished. A lot of things were just left up to the relatives of the people who were hurt to execute judgment. And so it's possible that Laban could have come and have killed Jacob, or certainly taken back these animals. But he could have done hurt to him, is what he said. But he referenced the fact that God had appeared to him in this dream and told him not to say anything good or bad to Jacob. God had intervened on his behalf. So in verse 30, and now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? So in other words, he's basically just letting him go, take all of the animals that he had bargained for. He wasn't going to enforce the covenant and make him serve this extra year and all of these things. But now he brings up the fact that Jacob had stolen his gods. And so here's Jacob's response. Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I said, peradventure thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Before our brethren discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. And so this reveals that Jacob had nothing to do with Rachel stealing these gods, but also this was not smart on his part, because the truth is Rachel is the one who had stolen these gods, and if they had been found, according to his own words, she could have been killed. And so this was not wise on his part to say that, but it did reveal that he had nothing to do with stealing these gods. So in verse 33, it says, Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the two maidservants' tents, but he found them not. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture and sat upon them, and Laban searched all of the tent, but found them not. And she said to her father, let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. Talking about that, it was her menstrual cycle, and she was just saying, please, I don't want to move. And he searched, but found not the images. And Jacob was wroth and chode with Laban. And Jacob answered and said unto Laban, what is my trespass, and what is my sin, that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? Did you know he left knowing that Laban could have done him some damage? But he was trusting God. God had given him a word that now go back to Isaac and Rebekah, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. And he was believing for that, and he now had a confirmation of it, because God had intervened by appearing unto Laban in a dream and telling him not to do any damage to Jacob. So Jacob now, his faith was rising, and he now actually was taking control of this situation. And he got mad at Laban and began to chide him and rebuke him for what he had done. And verse 37, whereas thou hast searched all my stuff, what hast thou found? And of all thy household stuff, set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, and they may judge betwixt us both. The 20 years have I been with thee. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of the flock have I not eaten. So he's now beginning, in a sense, he's venting. After 20 years of being taken advantage of by Laban, there's no scriptural account that he had ever rebuked Laban, that he had ever vented his frustration at the way he had been treated or anything, but now he's letting him have it. Amen. And recounting this. And he's also speaking about the blessing of God on him, that it was God's blessing. For 20 years, not to have the ewes and the she-goats cast their young. This is talking about a miscarriage. This is unusual. I used to pastor a group of ranchers, and I helped them one time pull calves and do things. And I guarantee you, it is not normal not to have some miscarriages and some stillbirths and things like this. But Jacob is saying that for 20 years, there hadn't been miscarriages, there hadn't been stillbirths, and that when one of the flock was eaten by an animal or something, he didn't, take that from Laban's flock. He absorbed the loss himself. In verse 39, that which was torn of beasts brought I not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night? Thus I was in the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my my sleep departed from mine eyes. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Again, we don't have 10 examples of this, but I suspect that what he said is absolutely true. It just wasn't all recorded. In verse 42, it says, except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely thou hast sent me away now empty. God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight. So again, this is an indication that Jacob is a totally changed person now. Jacob is crediting God. He is saying that it is God that has protected him, and it is God that intervened with this dream that Laban had. And Jacob is now trusting God and seeing God as the source of everything that he's done. He's a totally changed man. In verse 43, and Laban answered and said unto Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children. At that time they had 11 grandsons, Laban did, and of course there were other daughters, and so probably 15 or 20 children that were grandchildren. And these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto these my daughters, unto their children, which they have born? Now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. And Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar. You know, if you're familiar with the 28th chapter of Genesis, this is exactly what he did when he had this vision, this dream of a ladder extending into heaven and the angels of God ascending and descending upon it. He put a stone up and he poured a drink offering on top of it. And so this is the exact same thing that he's doing now. That was 20 years before when he did that, when he had the dream about the ladder. Here he is making this covenant with Laban, and he set up a stone and for a pillar. And it says in verse 46, and Jacob said unto his brethren, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap, and they did eat there upon the heap. You know, when you share a meal, that's a way of fellowship. You don't usually eat with people that you dislike. When you eat with a person, that's some way of having fellowship with the person. And so to have a meal like this is showing that there was friendship, that the animosity between them had been done away with. And in verse 47, it says, and Laban called it, I can't pronounce that. I'll try and sound it out. So I've got a phonetic thing here. Yersah had Utha. Forgive me for butchering that. But Jacob called it Gilead. And so that these are both of these names mean the exact same thing. It means the heap of witness. One was in Aramaic and the other was Hebrew. And so this name meant the heap of witness. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Gilead. And so Gilead is where Joshua said unto all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness unto us, for it hath heard all the words of the Lord. And you know, that basically this is what Laban and Jacob are doing also. You know, this, I have no idea if this is accurate or not, but I do know that when we were using cassette tapes and reel-to-reel tapes, that the iron oxide that was on those tapes, that when you record, it's how you made those recordings. Did you know iron oxide is from rocks? And those rocks can be aligned, those little shavings, that dusting of that iron oxide on that tape can be arranged to make a recording. And so it may not be inaccurate. It may not be only symbolism to say that this stone has heard the words that we've said and it will be a witness against us. If man can take iron and put it on a piece of tape and record something, I believe that God certainly could take literally a rock and have it record the words that were said. It could be a witness against us. So this might be something literal. In verse 49, so it was called Gilead in the last of verse 48, and in verse 49, and Mizpah, for he said, the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives besides my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. And Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap, and behold this pillar which I have cast betwixt me and thee. This heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. And the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us, and Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. So again, let me just mention that Laban was the son of Nahor, who was the brother of Abraham. So they were all related, and when he was doing this, he was swearing by the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, that he would be a witness and enforce this covenant that they were making with each other. Verse 54, then Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount and called his brethren to eat bread, and they did eat bread and tarried all night in the mount. And early in the morning Laban rose up and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them, and Laban departed and returned unto his place. And so that's the end of chapter 31. And basically this ends the story of Jacob as being connected to Laban, his father-in-law. So in the next chapter, we'll be getting into his encounter where he encounters the angels and actually wrestles with an angel, and then he begins to start having to deal with his brother Esau, who had threatened to kill him. And so, man, there are a lot of lessons to learn. And again, let me just say that we need to learn these lessons at Jacob's expense instead of us having to make the same mistakes. So praise God. This blesses me. I love the Word of God. I hope that you're receiving a lot out of it. So this comes to the end of chapter 31. I only have 1,158 chapters in the Bible to go.